when did philosophers first really start asking, okay, what's happening right now? What does this specific moment actually mean? You might think, well, isn't that always a core question? But our sources today point to a pretty specific turning point. Today we're digging into a really insightful text by Michel Foucault. He takes us back, way back to the late 18th century, to look at how Immanuel Kant, well, how he introduced a genuinely revolutionary way of thinking about time, about history, and maybe even about what philosophy itself is supposed to do. So this deep dive will be unpacking Foucault's take on Kant's essays, specifically What is Enlightenment, and also his later thoughts on the French Revolution. Our mission really is to grasp why Foucault sees Kant as kicking off this whole new philosophical tradition, one that's focused squarely on understanding, well, our presentness. And crucially, what does this mean for you as you're trying to make sense of your own moment in history? So let's start there. Foucault makes this pretty bold claim, doesn't he, that Kant's 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment, it actually introduced a completely new type of question into philosophy.
How is this so different from Kant's other writings about history?
Yeah, it's fascinating how Foucault singles this one out. I mean, Kant definitely wrote about history elsewhere. He looked into, the origins of history, defining concepts like race. He even explored the fulfillment of history. Think about his universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view. That piece looks at history moving towards some ultimate goal, its kind of inner purpose or teleology. But Foucault says, what is enlightenment? Isn't really asking those questions. It's not about our origins or our ultimate destination or some grand cosmic plan.
Okay, so if it's not about the past or the future in that sense, what was the question?
The unique question, Foucault argues, was about the present moment itself. It was basically asking, what is happening today, what's going on now, and what exactly is this now that we all find ourselves at?
But, that still sounds like something philosophers might naturally touch upon. How was Kant's way really distinct? I mean, think about someone like Descartes. He certainly refers to his own time, his situation.
That's a fair point, and Foucault addresses that. Descartes, for example, he referenced his historical situation in the realm of knowledge, right, to sort of justify his philosophical method, like in the Discourse on Method. But Foucault says for Kant, it wasn't just about what in the present might influence a philosophical choice. Kant's question was more fundamental. What is this present? It was about actively identifying, deciphering some specific meaningful element right within the contemporary moment, and then making that element the actual subject for philosophical reflection. Foucault suggests this hadn't really been done systematically before.
Right, so it's moving the present from context to the actual subject of inquiry.
Exactly. And what that means, Foucault argues, is that for the first time, philosophy started to really examine its own presentness, its own discursive relationship to the now, asking, how are our ideas shaped by this moment? And maybe more importantly, how can philosophy engage with and even shape this present? It sees itself as part of the event.
That feels like a really significant turn. And Foucault brings up another interesting point about the Enlightenment itself, the off-clearing. He says it was the first epoch which names its own self. What's the significance of that?
Well, unlike previous eras, which might just be, characterized later as periods of decline or prosperity or whatever, the off-clearing consciously gave itself its name. It wasn't just a label stuck on by historians centuries later. It was a kind of self-description happening in real time. And this self-awareness, Foucault points out, was based on seeing itself as a major event in the general history of thought, reason, and knowledge. It even defined its own mission, its motto, dare to know, sapere aude. This active self-definition is really key to this whole new philosophical stance.
Okay, so it's not just a label. It's an active self-understanding. And Foucault suggests this changes how we even think about modernity.
That's right. He contrasts it with the older way of thinking about modernity. Previously, he says, it was often framed as a sort of longitudinal relationship to the ancients. The whole debate. Are the ancients better than the moderns? Are we progressing or declining compared to them? It was about authority, comparison.
Right, looking backwards.
Exactly. But now, Foucault describes it as shifting to a sagittal relation to one's own presentness, like an arrow pointing right at the now. The questions become, what is my present? What's the meaning of this present moment? And what am I actually doing when I talk about this present? This kind of inward-looking, critical questioning of the present, Foucault argues, becomes the sort of defining feature of philosophy as a discourse of modernity and upon modernity.
And this focus, this interrogation of the present, it didn't just stop with the Enlightenment as they did it. Kant came back to this. You mentioned his reflections on the French Revolution. In 1798.
Yes, precisely. About 15 years later, Kant revisits this whole theme of the present, but now prompted by the massive event of the French Revolution. He tackles the question directly. Is there constant progress in the human race? This was in his work, The Conflict of the Faculties.
Okay, so how did he approach that question? How could you possibly prove constant progress?
Well, Kant's method was interesting. He argued that to demonstrate progress, you couldn't just speculate about causes. You needed a sign. An event that wasn't just a possible cause, but actually showed that underlying cause for progress and action. And this sign, he said, needed to be threefold. A signum rememorativum, showing it connects to the past, a signum demonstrativum, showing it's active right now, and a signum prognosticon, indicating it points towards the future. It had to somehow guarantee this general tendency of the whole human race to advance.
Wow, that's a tall order for a single sign. So what did he pick? The revolution itself must have seemed like a huge sign of something.
You'd think so. But here's where it gets really counterintuitive, and Foucault highlights this. Kant explicitly warns against looking for the sign in the big dramatic stuff, the momentous deeds or crimes, the overthrow of empires, the catastrophes.
Really? Not the storming of the Bastille or the Reign of Terror?
No. In fact, Kant goes so far as to say that even if a revolution like that could succeed, considering all the misery and atrocity involved, he says a sensible man would never make the trial at such a cost again. So for Kant, the actual success or failure of the revolution, the fighting and the politics, that wasn't the sign of progress.
Okay, I'm intrigued. If it wasn't the dramatic actions, what was the sign for Kant? What was he pointing to?
He focused on something much more subtle, almost passive, the spectacle of the revolution. Specifically, he pointed to the reaction of the observers, the witnesses, people who weren't actually involved in the fighting or the politics, but were watching it unfold. He talks about their wishful participation that borders closely on enthusiasm. It was this widespread, almost universal sympathy for the revolution's ideals, even among those who weren't French and weren't participating.
Enthusiasm from the spectators. That's unexpected. What did that enthusiasm reveal, according to Kant?
For Kant, this enthusiasm wasn't just fleeting emotion. It was proof, a sign of an underlying moral disposition of humanity. And this disposition, he believed, points towards two permanent political goals. First, the right of every people to choose its own political constitution's self-determination. And second, the desirability of a constitution designed to avoid offensive war, a republican constitution aimed at perpetual peace.
Connecting it back to his political philosophy.
Exactly. So this moral tendency, revealed by the onlooker's enthusiasm, that was the true sign of progress. And crucially, Kant connects this right back to the Aufklärung. The revolution, seen this way, through the lens of the spectator's reaction, it kind of completes and continues the process of Aufklärung. It's a manifestation of that same drive towards autonomy and rational self-governance.
And because that enthusiasm revealed something so fundamental about human nature.
Right. Kant argues that this event, the revolution, as a focal point for this global enthusiasm, it's too important, too much interwoven with the interests of humanity to ever be forgotten. Even if the revolution itself descended into terror or ultimately failed and reversed, the fact that it could inspire such widespread sympathy revealed this permanent potential, this faculty for betterment in human nature. And that guarantees future attempts at progress. Even if the specific attempt failed, it showed something enduring.
Okay, so let's bring this back to Foucault's overall argument. He sees these two moments, these two questions from Kant, what is Enlightenment, and then this later analysis of the revolution's meaning.
Yes, Foucault argues that these two questions, taken together, really define the core of what modern philosophy is about. Specifically, the ongoing philosophical questioning of what we are in our presentness. Who are we right now in this historical moment?
So, Kant essentially set the stage for how philosophy should operate in the modern world.
According to Foucault, yes. He argues Kant effectively founded two major critical traditions that branch out from his work. First, there's the tradition Foucault calls the analytic of truth. This is the line of inquiry focused on defining the universal conditions for true knowledge. Think epistemology, philosophy of science. Foucault says much of modern academic philosophy went down this path, trying to establish the limits and conditions of objective truth, largely following Kant's critique of pure reason.
Okay, the analytic of truth. What's the second tradition?
The second, and the one Foucault clearly places himself within, is what he calls the ontology of the present, or the ontology of ourselves. This tradition isn't asking about universal conditions of knowledge in the abstract. It's asking, what is our present? What is the specific, historically situated field of possible experience right now?
So much more historically grounded.
Precisely. It's about understanding ourselves as historical beings, shaped by our present. And Foucault sees this lineage running through thinkers like Hegel, Nietzsche, Max Weber, and the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School. They all, in their very different ways, are engaged in this critical diagnosis of their own present.
So for Foucault, engaging with Kant isn't just about historical curiosity. What's the takeaway? What should we do with this legacy of the Aufklärung?
Yeah, he's very clear about this. It's absolutely not about passively preserving some heritage of Aufklärung like it's a museum piece. For Foucault, the point is to keep the question alive, to actively engage with the very question of this event, the Enlightenment and its meaning. It's about confronting the question of the historicity of the thought of the universal. How do universal ideas play out in specific historical moments? We need to keep that critical interrogation of our present, the one Kant arguably started present and active in our own thinking. It's an ongoing task, not a finished chapter.
Right. It's about adopting the attitude, not just inheriting the answer.
Exactly. The critical attitude towards the present.
Okay, so just to recap then, we've explored how Kant, looking at both the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, really shifted philosophy's focus onto understanding the present moment, our now. And we've seen how Foucault traces a whole critical tradition back to this a tradition focused on this ontology of ourselves within our specific historical context. This deep dive into Kant and Foucault, it really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? If philosophy's task, since maybe the late 18th century, has been this constant questioning of our presentness, what does that mean for your present right now? What kind of sign might you look for in today's world? Something that reveals perhaps an enduring moral disposition towards progress, even with all the dramatic events and, let's face it, setbacks we see. And maybe more personally, how do you, as someone learning, thinking, participating in the world, how do you contribute to defining the meaning of this now that we all share? Something to ponder.